Javier snatched the invitation out of Nora's hand the moment she reached for it, then held it high above her head, laughing, making her look small in front of the entire office. "You actually thought this was real?" he said, loud enough for everyone to freeze. He let it drop. It fluttered to the floor at her feet. "Pick it up. Frame it. Closest you'll ever get to the Metropolitan Club." The room erupted. And Norah, she bent down, slowly, picked up that invitation, smoothed it against her palm, and said absolutely nothing. No tears, no trembling, just silence. The kind that means someone has already decided something you're not ready for. If you're new here, subscribe and stay until the very end, because this story is just getting started. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all truly began. Norah Vale had been at Hartwell and Stone for 14 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. Not that she counted. She simply had the kind of mind that retained details the way other people retained grievances. Quietly, precisely, and without drama. She arrived every morning at 7:45, 15 minutes before the official start of the workday, because she believed that a person's relationship with time said everything about their relationship with respect. She made coffee, not because it was her job, but because she had noticed early on that the office ran better when people had something warm in their hands before the first difficult conversation of the day. She drafted correspondence, managed schedules, prepared briefing documents so thorough that more than one partner had used them word for word in client meetings without credit. She did not complain. She did not ask for recognition. She came, she worked, she went home. To the people at Hartwell and Stone, Norah Vale was furniture. Useful furniture, certainly, the kind you rely on without ever thinking about where it came from, or what it cost, or whether it deserved to be in a better room. But furniture nonetheless. Javier Rivas had been at the firm for 7 years. He had the jawline, the suit, the handshake, and the confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. He was 34, a senior associate on the fast track to partnership, and he wore his ambition the way some men wear cologne, aggressively and in enclosed spaces. He was not entirely without talent. His legal instincts were sharp enough. His courtroom presence was polished. But the truth, the quiet, uncomfortable truth that no one at Hartwell and Stone said out loud, was that Javier's greatest skill was not law. It was performance. He knew exactly how to look like the most important person in whatever room he entered. And in 14 months, he had never once asked Norah Vale about her life before the firm. It was a Tuesday morning in October when the gala invitations arrived. The firm's annual charity gala at the Metropolitan Club was the event of the season for Manhattan's legal elite. Black tie, open bar, a silent auction for a children's literacy foundation that everyone genuinely ignored in favor of the networking. Partners used it to court clients. Associates used it to position themselves. Assistants, generally, did not attend. Javier received his invitation with the casual satisfaction of a man who expected good things to come to him. He turned it over in his hands, gold-embossed letters catching the morning light. And then he had an idea. The idea arrived the way bad ideas usually do in the minds of men like Javier, quickly, easily, dressed up as humor. He walked to Norah's desk. She was on the phone, speaking quietly, scribbling notes in the shorthand she'd developed that no one else in the office could decode. She held up one finger, one moment, and he stood there, which was already mildly irritating to him because Javier Rivas was not a man accustomed to waiting for people he considered beneath him. When she hung up, she looked at him. "Good morning, Javier. You need the Kessler brief?" "No," he said. And then he held out a second invitation. He'd palmed one from the stack on the reception desk on his way over. "I'm inviting you to the gala." Norah looked at the envelope, then at him. Her expression did not change, which should have been his first warning, though he was not paying attention to warnings. "The gala," she said, "Friday night, Metropolitan Club." He set the envelope on her desk like he was doing her a favor. "It'll be good for you. See how the other half lives." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that meant something other than warmth. Behind him, Marcus Chen, a second-year associate who had appointed himself the unofficial audience for most of Javier's performances, was pretending to look at his phone. Across the room, Brittany Holloway, who had been at the firm 3 years longer than Javier and resented him quietly for it, paused her typing. The office had developed a particular kind of collective hearing when it came to Javier's interactions with Norah. People listened without appearing to listen. Norah picked up the envelope. She did not open it. She simply held it for a moment, and something moved across her face. Not embarrassment, not gratitude, and not the amused surprise Javier had been hoping for. It was something cooler and harder to name. "Thank you," she said. "Don't worry about the dress code," Javier said. And this was the moment Marcus looked up from his phone, because the tone had shifted into something that required witnesses. "I'm sure whatever you own will be fine." The laughter came immediately. Marcus, 2 paralegals near the copier, even Derek Walsh, a third-year associate who generally kept his head down, made a sound that was either a cough or a suppressed laugh. And Norah said nothing. She looked at Javier, just looked at him. Her eyes were steady and dark and entirely unreadable. And then she set the envelope neatly on the corner of her desk and went back to her work, as if the conversation had simply ended, as if she had chosen to end it. Javier walked away feeling victorious, which was the first of several large mistakes he would make that week. The second mistake happened at lunch. He was in the corner booth at the Italian place on 54th that the firm partners used for client dinners, sitting across from Camila Reyes, his girlfriend of 2 years. Camila was a litigation associate at a competing firm, beautiful in the sharpest sense of the word, with the kind of precise opinions about people that she delivered like verdicts. She was the sort of woman who made you feel approved of when she smiled at you, and slightly indicted when she didn't. "So you actually invited her," Camila said, swirling her wine. "It's not really an invitation," Javier said. "She won't come. You think a woman like that has anything appropriate to wear to the Metropolitan Club?" "A woman like what?" "You know what I mean." Camila tilted her head slightly. "Tell me." He shrugged. "She's fine at what she does, but she's an assistant, Cam. She answers phones. She makes coffee. She is not a Metropolitan Club kind of person." Camila was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And if she shows up?" "She won't. But if she does," Javier smiled, "then it'll be the most interesting thing that happens at a Hartwell charity gala in a decade." What he meant, what the smile communicated perfectly to the woman sitting across from him was, it would be funny. Watching someone like Norah Vale try to exist in a room she didn't belong in would be entertainment. That was the whole point. Camila looked at him for a long moment, then she smiled back. "Well," she said, "let's hope she shows up then." Norah spent her lunch break that Tuesday the same way she spent most lunch breaks, at her desk, eating a sandwich, reading. She was reading a dense academic text on microfinance systems in sub-Saharan Africa, which would have surprised most of her colleagues had any of them been paying enough attention to notice the title. No one was. The invitation sat in the corner of her desk all afternoon. She neither threw it away nor opened it. At 4:45, she put on her coat, picked up her bag, and on her way to the elevator, she picked up the envelope and put it in her bag without ceremony. The woman at the boutique on Madison Avenue knew her. This was perhaps the most quietly revelatory fact about Norah Vale, though no one at Hartwell and Stone would ever know it. The woman's name was Sylvia. She was 62, and she had been dressing Norah for 4 years. "The red one," Sylvia said immediately when Norah explained the occasion. "I was thinking something quieter," Norah said. Sylvia gave her a look that only a woman who has spent 40 years understanding what clothes communicate could give. "Norah, the red one." There was a pause. Then Norah said, "All right." She was home by 8. She called her sister in Boston, talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, made tea, and went to bed. By Thursday, the gala had become the subject of active conversation at Hartwell and Stone in a way that Javier found increasingly satisfying. Marcus had told Derek had told the paralegals had told the 2 junior associates on the Meridian case, and by Thursday afternoon, a quiet shameful momentum had built around the idea of watching Norah Vale show up to the Metropolitan Club in the wrong shoes. "She's actually going," Marcus said to Javier, low and conspiratorial, by the elevator. Javier looked up. "What?" "She told the reception coordinator she'd be attending, gave them her name for the guest list. Norah Vale won." Marcus looked like he'd just won something. "I'm telling you, it's going to be fine," Javier said, but his voice had taken on an edge of something. Not quite discomfort, just a recalibration. He had not genuinely believed she would come. He walked back to his office. He sat down. He looked at the framed photo on his desk, himself at a partner event 2 years ago, shaking hands with Edward Hartwell himself, both of them grinning. And he felt, very briefly, a small, cold thing in the bottom of his stomach that he immediately refused to identify as doubt. Norah was at her desk typing. She did not look up when he passed. The day of the gala was a Friday in the second week of October, and New York had decided to be beautiful about it. The air was cold and clear, and the Metropolitan Club glowed against the darkening sky like it had been placed there specifically to remind people of their place in the social order. Javier arrived with Camila at 7:30. She wore black, sleek and deliberate, and she moved through the room with the confidence of a woman who understood that elegance was a form of argument. They collected their drinks, exchanged greetings with 3 partners, 2 clients, and 1 federal judge whose name Javier forgot and retrieved from context clues. It was exactly the sort of evening Javier was built for. By 8:15, he had almost stopped thinking about Norah entirely. Almost. And then the room changed. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was more like a pressure shift, the particular silence that happens not when a room goes quiet, but when a room forgets to maintain its noise. Conversations didn't stop so much as they stuttered. Heads turned, not all at once, but in the slow, involuntary way that attention moves when something pulls it. Javier turned. Norah Vale stood at the entrance to the ballroom. She was wearing red, a dress simple enough in its design that anyone could have dismissed it immediately. Except that it didn't allow itself to be dismissed. It had the quiet authority of something that cost exactly what it looked like it cost, which was more than most people in the room would have assumed she could afford. Her hair was up, simple and clean. She wore a single bracelet on her right wrist that caught the chandelier light and released it slowly, like it had made a considered decision about how much attention to invite. She was not looking around with the wide eyes of someone uncertain about where to stand. She was not pulling at her hem or scanning faces for approval. She walked into the room the way someone walks into a room they have walked into many times before, with the ease of a person who has long since stopped needing permission to be somewhere. The silence lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5. And in those 4 or 5 seconds, Javier Rivas watched 14 months of his assumptions rearrange themselves in his chest into something he didn't have a clean word for. Camila said something beside him. He didn't hear it. Norah took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and turned to look at the room. And for just a moment, her eyes found his. Not triumphantly, not with any drama at all. She simply saw him, the way she always saw him, with that quiet, complete attention that he had never bothered to interpret correctly. And then she turned and walked into the crowd. Marcus appeared at Javier's elbow. He was not laughing. "Okay," Marcus said. "Okay, so." He stopped. He didn't have a follow-up. Javier said nothing. He watched Norah move through the crowd. He watched 3 different people stop her. He watched the conversations begin. He watched the body language of people who were, within 45 seconds of meeting her, leaning in, interested, engaged, treating her the way people treat someone who has said something compelling. "Who did you think she was?" Camila said beside him. Her voice was neutral in the way that meant it was not neutral at all. "My assistant," Javier said. "Right," Camila said. She took a slow sip of her champagne. "Your assistant." Across the room, Norah was laughing at something a white-haired man in a European-cut suit had said. The laugh was real, warm and unguarded, and entirely at odds with the composed, quiet version of her that Javier saw every single weekday from 9 to 6. He had worked beside this woman for 14 months. He'd handed her documents and asked for coffee and made a joke at her expense in front of an audience on Tuesday. He had invited her to this event because he had believed with complete and unexamined certainty that she would not belong here. And now she was on the other side of the room, belonging harder than he had managed in 7 years. "I need another drink," Javier said. He went to the bar. He stood there longer than he meant to. He ordered scotch, which he only drank when he was uncomfortable, a tell that Camila had pointed out to him once over dinner, and that he had dismissed and never forgotten. The bartender slid the glass toward him, and Javier picked it up and turned back to the room. And that was when he saw who the white-haired man was. Etienne Marot. Javier's hand tightened slightly on the glass. Etienne Marot was not simply a man at a charity gala. Etienne Marot was a name that partners at Hartwell and Stone mentioned with the reverence typically reserved for constitutional amendments. He was a Belgian investor, 71 years old, with holdings across 4 continents and a reputation for the kind of strategic instinct that had made him wealthy in 3 separate fields over 5 decades. He had been flown in specifically, Javier knew, as the centerpiece of the firm's client cultivation efforts. 3 Hartwell partners had spent the better part of 2 months preparing for tonight's introduction. He was standing with Norah Vale. He was not networking. He was not being polite. He was talking to her with the particular intensity of a man who has encountered something unexpected and is choosing, deliberately, to pay attention to it. Javier set his scotch down on the bar. He crossed the room. He did not have a plan. He simply moved. He was 8 feet away when he heard Marot say in his accented, unhurried English, "But the Dakar program, I had heard it was discontinued after the funding restructure. I didn't know anyone from the original team was still..." "Still what?" Norah said. And her voice was different. Not different in pitch or volume, but different in texture. Relaxed in a way that her voice in the office never was. Like a word pronounced correctly after months of polite mispronunciation. "Still accessible," Marot said, and he smiled the way men smile when they realize they've been underestimating something. "I tried twice to get your contact information through the foundation. The person I spoke to said you'd moved on." "I had," Norah said simply. "I needed to." "Well," Marot lifted his glass, "the world's loss." And apparently, he glanced around the room at the Hartwell and Stone logo on the event banner, at the gathered legal elite of Manhattan, with the calm assessment of a man who can afford to find anything mildly amusing, someone's unexpected gain. Javier stopped walking. He stood very still. Something cold and specific was moving through him now, and it wasn't the scotch. He had known Norah Vale for 14 months. He had watched her answer phones and organize calendars and fetch documents. He had made a joke at her expense 4 days ago, and people had laughed. And he had walked away feeling like he'd won something small and easy. And this man who had restructured the financial architecture of emerging markets across 3 continents, this man whose attention the entire firm had been angling for all evening, this man knew her name. Not her name from a business card, not her name from an introduction. He knew her name the way people know the names of people who have changed something in the world, with respect, with recognition, with the slight, genuine regret of having lost track of someone whose work had mattered. Javier Rivas stood at the edge of a conversation he had not been invited into, at a party he had organized partly as a joke at Norah Vale's expense, and understood for the first time that he had made a mistake so large it had no clean edges. But he didn't yet know how large. That part was still coming. Norah had not looked at him. She was still talking to Marot, and her back was partly turned, and there was nothing hostile or deliberate in the positioning. She simply hadn't noticed him. Or perhaps she had, and had decided, with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, that his presence was not relevant to this particular moment. And that That offhand, utterly unintentional dismissal landed harder than anything else that night. Marcus appeared at his shoulder again. He had a new drink and an expression that had lost all traces of amusement. "That's Etienne Marot she's talking to," Marcus said, as if Javier might not have registered it. "I know," Javier said. "Hartwell's been trying to get 5 minutes with that man all evening." "I know, Marcus." A pause. Then, quietly, Marcus said, "Who is she?" Javier looked at the back of Nora's head, the clean line of her neck, the single bracelet catching the light. "I have no idea," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said all week. Javier stood at the edge of that room and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not embarrassment, not quite. It was closer to the sensation of reaching for the top shelf and realizing, midway through the motion, that you are not as tall as you thought you were. He picked up his scotch from the bar. He put it back down. He picked it up again. Across the room, Norah was still talking to Etienne Marot, and the conversation had not shortened. If anything, it had deepened. Marot had shifted his posture in the way that men of his age and standing only do when something genuinely holds their attention. Weight forward, chin down, eyes focused. He was not performing interest. He was experiencing it. 3 feet away, Hartwell partner Richard Calloway stood watching the same scene with an expression that Javier had never seen on Richard Calloway's face before. Richard was 61, silver-haired, the kind of man who had shaken enough hands over enough decades that his face had settled permanently into polite neutrality. But right now, Richard Calloway looked like a man watching a card game he thought he understood, realizing the deck had been different from the one he was picturing. "Is that Marot talking to your girl?" Richard said, not looking at Javier. "She's not my girl," Javier said. "She's my assistant." Richard finally turned to look at him. The expression was brief and precise. "Not from where I'm standing," he said, and walked away. Camila appeared at Javier's side with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been watching everything from a calculated distance. She handed him a fresh glass of champagne he hadn't asked for and said, "I think you should go talk to her." "Why?" "Because Richard Calloway just walked over there," Camila said, "and in approximately 45 seconds, every senior partner in this room is going to do the same thing. And you're going to be standing here, holding a scotch you're not drinking, looking like you have no idea who she is." She paused. "Which, as it turns out, you don't." It was not a kind thing to say. It was also not wrong. Javier straightened his jacket. He crossed the room. He moved with the controlled ease of a man who had spent years practicing the art of entering conversations as though he belonged in them, and he reached the small cluster of people now forming around Norah and Marot and inserted himself into the outer edge with a smile that cost him more than it looked like. "Javier," Marot said immediately, which surprised him, "I was just telling this Vale. I don't recall the last time I had a conversation at one of these events that actually required my full attention." "Norah has that effect," Javier said, and the sentence left his mouth before he could examine what it was built on, because the truth was, he had no idea if Norah had that effect. He had never given her enough space to demonstrate it. Norah looked at him then, not pointedly, not coldly. She looked at him the way she always looked at him in the office, with that level, unhurried attention that he had always read as deference, and now understood, with the particular sourness of a corrected assumption, was simply clarity. She saw him. She had always seen him. He was the one who hadn't been paying attention. "Javier invited me tonight," Norah said to Marot, and the sentence was perfectly constructed in its simplicity. Not grateful, not resentful, just factual. Marot raised his eyebrows slightly. "Did he?" "He did," she said. And there it was, the thing hanging in the air between those 3 words that no one in the circle acknowledged out loud, but everyone heard. The slight, delicate weight of context. The thing Norah did not say, which was, "He invited me as a joke." The thing she did not need to say, because her presence here, in this dress, having this conversation, had already said it loudly enough for the whole room. Javier smiled. He held the smile. He was very good at holding smiles. Mauro turned back to Norah. "You were telling me about the transition out of the Geneva work. What finally made the decision?" And Norah began to speak, and Javier stood there and listened, and what he heard dismantled him, piece by piece, quietly, with no more drama than a key turning in a lock. She had spent 3 years in Geneva with an international development organization, coordinating financial access programs across 11 countries. Before that, 2 years in Nairobi, building the operational framework for a micro-lending initiative that had, according to Mauro, become a model that 3 other institutions had replicated. She had presented at the World Economic Forum. She had sat across tables from ministers and fund directors and institutional investors of the exact same caliber as the man she was currently speaking with. Not as a guest, not as support staff, but as the person running the room. "The Dakar program," Mauro said, and the reverence in his voice when he said it was unmistakable, "changed the way certain people in my circle thought about blended finance in West Africa. I mean that without exaggeration. There are funds operating differently today because of the framework your team built." Norah accepted this the way she accepted most things, without performance. "It was a collective effort," she said. "Your name was on it," Mauro said simply. Javier became aware that Marcus Chen was standing 3 feet behind him and had been standing there long enough to have heard all of this. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel Marcus processing the information with the slow, grinding recalibration of someone whose entire understanding of the social architecture of the last 14 months was being quietly revised. Richard Calloway had rejoined the circle. He was listening with the careful attention of a man calculating. Javier's champagne glass was empty. He didn't remember drinking it. "And now you're at Hartwell and Stone," Mauro said to Norah, and the sentence had a shape to it, a gentle upward curve at the end that was not quite a question and not quite a judgment. It was the tone of a man who was curious about a choice that did not fit the pattern. Something moved across Norah's face. It was fast, and it was real, and it was the first moment all evening where Javier saw the composed surface of her shift, just slightly, into something more human and more complicated. "For now," she said, and those 2 words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Javier heard the ripple of them go through the circle. Richard Calloway's chin lifted. Mauro smiled, small and knowing. "For now," Mauro repeated, and he nodded as if that was the most satisfying answer she could have given. Camila touched Javier's arm from behind. He turned. Her face was doing something controlled and complex that he recognized as the precursor to a very specific kind of conversation she preferred to have in private. But they were not in private. They were surrounded by 60 of the most well-connected people in Manhattan legal circles, and there was nowhere to go, and so she simply said, very quietly, "You should have told me." "Told you what?" "That she was—" Camila stopped. She looked across at Norah. "That she was this." "I didn't know," Javier said. "That is not the reassuring answer you think it is," Camila said. She walked away, not storming. Camila did not storm. She moved with the precision of a woman who has made a calculation and is implementing it. And the direction she moved was toward the bar, which meant she needed a moment, which meant the conversation they were eventually going to have was going to require more than a moment. Javier turned back to the circle. Norah was speaking to Mauro again, and now a woman had joined them. Patricia Sung, a client so significant to the firm that her name was said in hushed tones in internal meetings. Patricia Sung did not normally seek out people at these events. People sought her out. But she was standing next to Norah Vale with her arms uncrossed, which was, if you knew Patricia Sung, the equivalent of a standing ovation. "I heard your name connected to the East African credit infrastructure work," Patricia was saying. "My foundation looked at that model extensively. There was a paper, the 2019 working paper," Norah said. "Yes, I co-authored the second half." Patricia looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "That paper changed the direction of 2 of our grant programs," she said. "I'm not being polite. I'm stating a fact." "I know," Norah said. And she did not say it arrogantly. She said it the way a person says a true thing, plainly, without apology, without the performative humility that is really just another form of seeking approval. Javier felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned. It was Edward Hartwell himself, the senior founding partner, 73, who appeared at the gala every year for exactly 90 minutes and spent that time making every person he spoke to feel simultaneously important and irrelevant. "Your assistant," Hartwell said, nodding toward Norah. "She knows Marrow." "So it appears," Javier said. "Not just knows him," Hartwell said. "He's been trying to get her attention for the last 20 minutes and looking grateful that she's giving it." He looked at Javier. The look was not warm. "What do you know about her background?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. In the context of a conversation with Edward Hartwell, 3 seconds was geologically significant. "I'm learning," Javier said. Hartwell made a sound that was not quite a word. "Learn faster," he said. And then he walked toward the circle around Norah, and Javier watched the most powerful person at Hartwell and Stone insert himself with careful intent into a conversation with his assistant and extend his hand and smile the smile that he reserved for people whose goodwill he was interested in cultivating. Marcus materialized. He had given up all pretense of casual observation. "Okay," he said, "I have to say something." "Please don't," Javier said. "She is—" "Marcus." "The Tuesday thing," Marcus said, and his voice had lost its usual easy quality. "In front of everyone, with the invitation." "I know." "And you said her dress would be—" "I know what I said, Marcus." "She heard every word of it, man." Javier said nothing. He looked at the circle around Norah. Morrow, Calloway, Patricia Sung, now Hartwell, and he thought about Tuesday morning. The hallway, the gold-embossed envelope fluttering to the floor, the laughter from Derek and the paralegals, the way Norah had bent down and picked it up without a word, smoothed it against her palm, and put it in her bag. He had thought that was submission. He understood now, with a cold and total clarity, that it was not. It was patience. It was the action of a woman who already knew something no one else in that hallway knew, who understood that Tuesday morning was not the event. Tonight was the event, and she had simply been waiting for tonight. "Did you ever ask her," Marcus said, "about who she was before?" "No," Javier said. Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't look satisfied by the answer. He just looked tired. 14 months, he said, and then he walked away too. Javier stood alone at the edge of a room he had helped organize, surrounded by people he had spent years cultivating, and he had never felt more like a stranger. He thought about all the times he had walked past Norah's desk and handed her something without making eye contact. He thought about the afternoons he'd said, "Norah, I need the Kessler file," and she'd had it in his hands before he'd finished the sentence, because she had already anticipated it. He thought about the briefing document for the Ashworth deposition that had been so thorough, so precisely organized, that he had used it almost verbatim in his opening, and said nothing afterward except, "Good work," while already moving down the hallway. Good work. 14 months of good work, said the way you say it to furniture. He crossed to the circle. People made room. Not for him, not specifically, but because the circle had grown large enough that movement within it was natural. He positioned himself so that he was visible to Norah without being directly in front of her, and he waited. She was telling Morrow about the decision to leave Geneva. Her voice was steady and direct. "I lost someone," she said simply. "A colleague, close friend. It was sudden, and I needed to stop. I needed to come home and be still for a while. The work I was doing required everything. I had nothing left to give it." Morrow nodded with the gravity of a man who understands what it costs to say that in a room full of people who measure success by output. "And the position here?" "It was an anchor," Norah said. "Something manageable, predictable. It wasn't permanent. It was—" She paused. "It was a breath." Javier heard this and felt something shift inside his ribcage. Not guilt exactly, something uglier and more honest than guilt. Because what he heard when she said it was the truth of what Hartwell and Stone had been to her, a temporary shelter, and what she had been to them, to him, was a joke, a background figure, a name on a coffee order. And she had been breathing here. She had come here to rest. And they had used the time she was catching her breath to make her the punchline. Richard Calloway caught Javier's eye across the circle. Richard's expression communicated something specific and uncomfortable. It was the expression of a man revising a judgment. Not about Norah, about Javier. The gala moved on around them. The silent auction paddles went up. The string quartet shifted to something brighter. Waiters circulated with dessert and champagne. But within the orbit of that particular corner of the Metropolitan Club's ballroom, the real event of the evening was the quiet, steady, unstoppable process of an entire room's assumptions being rearranged by a woman in a red dress who was not doing anything except being exactly who she had always been. At 9:40, Mauro said something to Norah that Javier didn't catch, and Norah laughed. That warm, real, unguarded laugh that Javier had never once heard in the office. And Mauro reached into his jacket and produced a card, which he offered with both hands, the way people offer cards when they mean it. Norah took it. She looked at it for a moment, then at him. "You know I'm not in that world anymore," she said. "Not at the moment," Mauro said. She put the card in her small clutch and said, "I'll think about it." "That's all I ask," he said. And that exchange, 8 seconds, 2 sentences, Javier understood immediately, contained more professional significance than anything he had achieved in 7 years at Hartwell and Stone. Because what Mauro was offering was not a card, it was a door. And Norah had not walked through it immediately, not because she didn't see it, but because she was the kind of person who chose her doors deliberately. Camilla reappeared. She was calmer now, in the controlled way that came after a decision rather than before one. She stood beside Javier and looked at Norah and said, "She's not what you thought." "No," Javier said. "What did you actually think she was?" The question was not rhetorical. Camila asked it the way she asked questions in depositions, because she wanted the actual answer, not the managed one. Javier thought about it. He thought about it honestly, which was harder than it should have been. "I thought she was someone who needed us," he said. "I thought this job was her ceiling." Camila was quiet for a moment. Then, "And now?" "Now I think we were her floor," he said, "just somewhere to stand while she decided what came next." Something moved across Camila's face. It might have been respect. It might have been the particular unease that comes from hearing someone you're close to say something true about themselves that you weren't sure they were capable of. She didn't say anything. She just stood there beside him, and they both looked at Norah Vale in her red dress, talking to people whose names were on buildings, being seen for exactly who she was. At 10:15, Norah excused herself from the circle with a quiet word and moved toward the coat check. The evening was winding toward its end. Javier moved without deciding to move and reached the marble corridor just as she was collecting her coat. "Norah," he said. She turned. She looked at him with that same clear, level attention, not guarded, not warm, present. He had things he wanted to say. He had a rehearsed version of several sentences forming in his head, things about the invitation, about Tuesday, about good work said carelessly in empty hallways. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was something else entirely. "I didn't know," he said. Norah looked at him for a long moment. "I know you didn't," she said. "I should have." "Yes," she said, "you should have." No softening, no reassurance, just the plain shape of the truth, offered without cruelty and without comfort. The way Norah Vale had always done things, he was beginning to understand. Precisely, honestly, without needing anything from the other person's reaction. She put on her coat. She picked up her small clutch. She looked at him one more time. "Good night, Javier," she said, and she walked out. He stood in the corridor for a long moment after she left. The party noise behind him continued. Someone was giving a toast. There was applause. The world of Hartwell and Stone moved forward as it always did, smooth and confident and entirely certain of itself. But Javier Rivas stood very still and felt the weight of a question he had never thought to ask. Not about Norah, not now that it was too late for the asking to be casual, but about himself. About what kind of person spends 14 months beside someone and never once thinks to wonder who they are. He didn't like the answer, but for the first time in a very long time, he couldn't find a way to argue with it. The ride home was quiet in the way that certain silences are not actually quiet at all. Camila sat on her side of the cab with her coat folded across her lap and her eyes on the window, and Javier sat on his side with his hands loose in his lap and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make things worse. The city moved past the glass in its usual indifferent blur, all yellow light and wet pavement, and neither of them spoke for 11 blocks. Then Camila said, "How long has she worked for you?" 14 months, Javier said. And in 14 months you never, not once, asked her about her life. It was not a question. He answered it anyway. No. Another silence. 4 blocks this time. "I have to tell you something," Camila said. She turned from the window. Her voice had settled into the register she used when she had made a decision and was now executing it, which was a voice Javier had learned to take seriously. "I knew something was off the moment she walked in. Not about her, about you, the way you were watching her. You had the face of someone who has just realized they left something important on the train." "Cam." "I'm not angry about that," she said, cutting him off cleanly. "I'm angry about the Tuesday thing, the invitation on the floor, the comment about her dress." She paused. "You did that in front of people." "I know." "You did it because you wanted an audience." He didn't answer. "And you got one," she said. "You just didn't anticipate that the story would change." The cab stopped at a red light. Somewhere outside, a horn. The ordinary sounds of a city that did not care about any of this. "What are you saying?" Javier asked. "I'm saying you owe her an apology that is not about your career," Camila said. "Not about Morrow, not about Hartwell, not about how it looked. A real one. Because what you did on Tuesday was cruel, Javier. Not competitive, not political, cruel. And I sat at that lunch table and laughed along. And that's on me. But you're the one who handed her the invitation like a weapon." The light changed. The cab moved forward. "I know," Javier said, for the 3rd time that night. And for the 3rd time, it was true and insufficient in equal measure. Camila looked at him for a long moment. "Good night," she said, not coldly, not warmly, with the precision of a woman who was choosing very deliberately to stop the conversation here and pick it up somewhere more honest, at a time when both of them had slept and thought and were not still wearing the faces they'd worn to a charity gala. She got out at her building. He continued to his. He did not sleep well. The Monday morning after the gala at Hartwell and Stone operated on 2 frequencies simultaneously. On the surface, it was a normal Monday. Coffee cups, keyboard sounds, the low ambient noise of a firm moving through its cases. But underneath that normalcy, something else was running. A current, the specific hum of a social environment processing new information, recalibrating its hierarchies, deciding what the weekend had meant. Javier arrived at 8:15, which was 30 minutes later than usual, because he had spent the 20 minutes before leaving his apartment standing at his kitchen counter with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, having a conversation with himself that he lost. He walked to his office. He passed Norah's desk. She was there. 7:45, as always. On the phone, as often. She looked up when he passed, gave him the standard professional nod of acknowledgement, and returned to her call. No tension in her posture, no pointed silence, no performance of grievance. She was simply there, doing her job, as if Friday night had happened and Monday morning had happened, and both were simply facts in the same continuous reality. He found this more unsettling than hostility would have been. He sat at his desk. He opened his email. The first thing he saw was a message from Edward Hartwell, sent at 7:52 that morning. Subject line, blank. Body reading, my office, 10 o'clock. Javier read it twice. He closed his laptop. He opened it again. Marcus knocked on his open door at 9:15. Marcus was carrying 2 coffees, which meant he wanted a real conversation and was using the coffees as social scaffolding. He set one on Javier's desk and sat in the chair across from him without being invited, which Marcus only did when he had decided something was important enough to risk the imposition. "You talked to her yet?" Marcus said. "It's 9:15, Javier said. "I'm not asking about a formal meeting. I mean, did you talk to her?" "She was on the phone when I came in." Marcus nodded. He drank his coffee. He had the look of a man who had spent the weekend thinking about something and had arrived at work ready to say it out loud. "I called Derek Saturday," he said. "We talked about the gala." "I assumed." "Not in a gossipy way," Marcus said, though the distinction between the two was probably thinner than he thought. More like trying to understand what happened, how none of us knew. "We didn't ask," Javier said flatly. Marcus paused. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's what Derek said too." He looked at the coffee in his hands. "I've been at this firm 4 years. I've said good morning to that woman approximately 800 times. I know her coffee order. I know she takes the express to Lexington. I know she has a sister somewhere in New England. And I don't know a single thing that actually matters about who she is." He looked up. "That's on me. But the invitation thing," he stopped. "That was on you." Javier said nothing. "Half the office was in that hallway, man. Brittany recorded it on her phone. Not publicly, but she has it." The coffee cup in Javier's hand was suddenly much heavier. "She won't post it," Marcus said quickly. Brittany doesn't operate that way. But the fact that it exists means the story exists. And after Friday night, the story has a different shape than it would have had a week ago." Javier set his cup down. "What shape does it have now?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He chose his next words with care. "The shape of a man who embarrassed someone in public who turned out to be significantly more accomplished than he is," he said, "and who did it on purpose, in front of witnesses." The silence in the office was very specific, the kind that follows a true thing said out loud for the first time. "Hartwell wants to see me at 10, Javier said. Marcus nodded slowly. "I know," he said. He sent a similar note to Richard Calloway this morning. He stood. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much right now, I think the way you handled it at the gala, when you finally talked to her at the coat check, I think that was real. The look on your face when Mara was talking to her wasn't embarrassment, it was," he searched for the word, "recognition. Like you were seeing something you'd been looking at for a year without registering." "It doesn't undo Tuesday," Javier said. "No," Marcus agreed. "It doesn't." And he left. At 9:58, Javier stood up. He walked past Nora's desk. She was not on the phone this time. She was typing, head slightly down, the efficient and composed version of her that he saw every single day. He stopped. "Norah," he said. She looked up. "Can we—" he started. He stopped. He tried again. "I need to talk to you, after my 10 o'clock, if you have a few minutes." She looked at him with that clear, measuring attention. "Of course," she said, the way she always said it. Professional. Unreadable. He nodded. He walked to Hartwell's office. Edward Hartwell's corner office occupied a space that had been designed, consciously or not, to make the person sitting across the desk feel measurable. The furniture was old and deliberately so. The view was significant. Everything about the room communicated that the person behind the desk had arrived, and the conversation was about whether the person in front of it was on their way somewhere or not. Richard Calloway was already there when Javier arrived, seated to the side with the careful posture of a man present as witness rather than participant. Javier registered this and did not like what it registered as. Hartwell did not stand when Javier entered. He gestured to the chair across the desk. Javier sat. "Friday night," Hartwell said, no preamble. "Tell me about your assistant." "I'm learning more than I knew," Javier said. "That's apparent," Hartwell said. "What's also apparent is that Etienne Majo spent 40 minutes in conversation with a member of this firm's support staff at an event where we have been attempting to secure his attention for the better part of 6 months. He let that sit for a moment. "I'd like to understand why I had to find that out by watching it happen." I didn't know her background, Javier said. You've worked beside this woman for over a year. I know. Hartwell looked at him. It was the kind of look that didn't require words to be legible. Maro called this morning, he said. Javier went very still. He called to express interest in beginning a conversation about representation for a European infrastructure fund he's restructuring. Hartwell paused. In the conversation, he mentioned Norah Vale by name. He asked whether she was available to be part of any team that worked on his account. The room was very quiet. He asked for her specifically, Calloway said from the side, as though the clarification was necessary. He asked for my assistant, Javier said, and the word came out with a shape to it that was different from every other time he'd used it, thinner and stranger, like a coat that no longer fit. He asked for Ms. Vale, Hartwell said, and the correction was quiet but absolute. Who is, it turns out, one of the more accomplished professionals to have passed through this firm in some time. A fact that reflects a significant failure on our part and on yours specifically in terms of talent recognition and professional respect. He folded his hands on the desk. I want to have a conversation with her this week about her role here, a different conversation than whatever conversation she's been having for the last 14 months. Javier nodded. I'd also like to understand, Hartwell said, and his voice had not changed volume, but something in it had shifted downward, into the register of a man saying something he had decided needed to be said. What happened on Tuesday, in the hallway, with the invitation? The silence stretched. I made a mistake, Javier said. Describe it, Hartwell said, and Javier did. He described it plainly, without softening the edges. He said, I invited her as a joke. He said, I made a comment about her appearance in front of other people. He said, I expected her not to come, and I expected that to be funny. He said it all without the instinct to reframe or minimize that he would have applied to almost any other difficult conversation in his professional life. Because something had broken open in him Friday night in the coat check corridor, when Norah had said, yes, you should have, and simply left. And the only thing left in that corridor after she walked out was the plain, undecorated shape of what he'd done. Hartwell listened without interruption. Calloway listened without expression. When Javier finished, the room was quiet for a moment. You understand, Hartwell said finally, that this is not only a professional matter. Yes, Javier said. Good, Hartwell picked up a pen. I trust you'll handle the personal dimension with the same directness you just demonstrated. Because whatever happens with Ms. Vale's role going forward, she deserves a genuine accounting from you before anything else is discussed. He looked up from the desk. That's not a suggestion, Javier. That's the prerequisite. Javier left the office at 10:22. He stood in the hallway for a moment. He could hear the ordinary sounds of the floor. Keyboards, phones, the low murmur of conversations, the firm moving forward as it always did. He walked back toward his office. Norah was at her desk. She looked up as he approached. Are you free now? He said. Yes, she said. He pulled a chair from the adjacent desk, not the power positioning of his office, not across a formal desk, just two people at the same level, and he sat, close enough for a real conversation, far enough to give her space. I owe you an apology, he said. Not about Friday night, about Tuesday, the invitation, what I said about your dress. He paused. What I said was cruel. I said it in front of people on purpose because I thought it would be funny, and I thought you wouldn't be able to do anything about it. That's the honest version. No other explanation. Norah looked at him steadily. She said nothing yet. She was listening in the way she always listened, completely, without preparing her response while he was still talking. I didn't know who you were, he said, and I used that as a kind of permission to treat you as less than you are. I was wrong. The not knowing wasn't accidental. I chose not to ask. I chose not to see. He stopped. He had rehearsed some version of this in the mirror that morning and thrown all of it out because it had sounded like a closing argument, and this was not a courtroom. I'm sorry, Norah. Not because of Morrow, not because of Hartwell, because of Tuesday morning and 14 months of treating you like background. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of someone taking in something real and deciding what to do with it. "Can I ask you something?" Norah said. "Yes." "If Friday had never happened, if Morrow wasn't in that room, if Hartwell hadn't called you in this morning, would you be sitting here?" The question was asked without aggression, calmly, with the same direct, unadorned honesty she brought to everything. It was not a trap. It was a real question. She wanted a real answer. And Javier, who was, underneath the performance and the ambition and the carefully maintained persona of a man who always knew what room he was in this moment, just someone who had been asked a question he couldn't afford to answer dishonestly. "I don't know," he said. "I want to say yes. I think the gala would have shaken something loose. I think I would have been thinking about Tuesday all weekend regardless. But would I have sat down at your desk and said these specific words?" He stopped. "I don't know. And you deserve better than a version of this apology that I can't fully stand behind." Something shifted in Norah's face, the faintest change, like a tension she had been holding. Not dramatically, but continuously. The way you hold something for so long you forget you're holding it. Release slightly. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 14 months, she said. "I know," he said. She looked at her hands, then back at him. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," she said, "because it wasn't fine. The Tuesday thing in front of everyone," she paused. "I have stood in rooms with ministers and fund directors and people who had every structural reason to dismiss me, and I have handled all of it. But standing in that hallway and picking up that invitation off the floor while your colleagues laughed," she stopped again. Her voice had not changed in volume, but there was something in it now, briefly, that was real in a different way. That one I had to work to put down. Javier looked at her. He felt the weight of that sentence settle into him in a way that no professional reprimand from Hartwell had managed. "I know," he said. And this time the words meant something different than all the other times he'd said them that day. They meant, "I hear you," not "I acknowledge the situation." "I hear what it cost you." Norah nodded. She picked up her pen. She seemed to be deciding something. Then she said, "Hartwell is going to want to talk to me about my role." "Yes," Javier said. "I know what he's going to offer." She said it without arrogance, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has spent enough time in enough rooms to understand how these conversations go. "And I don't know yet what I'm going to say." "You don't have to know yet," Javier said. She looked at him. Something in the look was slightly different from any look she had given him before. Not warm exactly, but not the managed professional neutrality of the last 14 months either. Something in between. Something that acknowledged that the conversation they'd just had was real, that it mattered, that whatever happened next, something true had been said out loud in this ordinary corner of an office floor at 10:30 on a Monday morning. "No," she agreed. "I don't." She turned back to her desk. He stood, returned the chair to where he'd found it, and walked to his office. He sat down. He looked at the framed photo on his desk, the handshake with Hartwell, both of them grinning, the picture of a man who thought he knew exactly what he was building and what it was worth. His phone buzzed, a text from Camila. "We need to talk tonight, not about the firm, about us." He put the phone face down on the desk. Outside his office, through the glass partition, he could see Norah at her desk. She was on the phone again, composed, efficient, entirely herself. And for the first time in 14 months, Javier Rivas looked at her and saw not what she was doing for him, but what she was doing in spite of him. The distinction was small. It was also everything. At 11:40, Brittany Holloway stopped by his open door. She had an expression that was trying hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "Hartwell's assistant called," she said. "He moved the Norah meeting to Thursday." "Okay," Javier said. Brittany lingered. She was deciding something. Then she said, "For what it's worth, and I know you didn't ask, she handled the Tuesday thing with more grace than most people in this building would have, including me." She paused. "That's not a compliment to you, but it's the truth about her." "I know," Javier said. Brittany left. The morning continued. The firm moved forward. And somewhere in the architecture of Hartwell and Stone, a woman who had come here to breathe was quietly deciding whether she was done resting. No one yet knew which way she would land, but they were all, for the first time in 14 months, paying attention. The conversation with Camila happened on Monday evening at 7:30 in her apartment with 2 cups of tea that neither of them touched. Camila had arranged herself on the couch with the particular posture of a woman who has spent the hours between work and this moment deciding exactly how honest she intends to be, and has landed on completely. She was wearing a gray sweater and no jewelry, which meant she was not performing anything. She was just there, present and direct, and tired of the version of things they had been maintaining. "I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish," she said. "Okay," Javier said. "I have spent 2 years watching you treat people as props in your own narrative," she said. "Clients, junior associates, the parking attendant at your building whose name you have been told 4 times. She paused. "I told myself it was just how you operated, that underneath it, there was something real. And there is something real, Javier. I'm not saying there isn't." She looked at him steadily. "But Friday night, I watched you stand in that room and have the thing you did to that woman reflected back at you in real time. And the look on your face." She stopped. "It wasn't shame, not at first. It was calculation. You were already figuring out how to manage it." He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. "I'm not finished," she said. He closed his mouth. "It wasn't until the coat check, when you talked to her. That's when it became real for you. And I was watching from across the room, and I could see the difference between the 2 moments. And the difference scared me." She picked up her tea, then put it back down without drinking. "Because if it takes a public unraveling to make you feel the actual human weight of something you did, what does that mean for the things you've done that had no audience?" The apartment was quiet. Somewhere outside, traffic, the ordinary sounds of a city moving through its evening. Javier did not say, "I know." He had used that phrase enough times in the last 4 days that it had worn down to something hollow. Instead, he said, "You're right." "I know I'm right," Camila said. "What I need to know is what you're going to do with that." It was the most important question anyone had asked him in years, and he did not have a clean answer to it. And for the first time in a very long time, he did not manufacture one. He sat with the absence of an answer and let her see him sitting with it. "I don't know yet," he said. Camila looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they've heard something true, even if it isn't the thing they were hoping for. "Okay," she said. "Then I need some time to figure out what I'm doing with that." They parted at 9, not with anger, not with finality, with the careful, bruised honesty of 2 people who had said real things to each other and needed space to determine what those real things meant for what came next. Javier took the long way home. He walked 15 blocks instead of hailing a cab. The cold air helped, not with the answers, but with the weight of carrying the questions. Tuesday and Wednesday passed with the surface appearance of normalcy and the internal texture of everything. Javier worked. He prepared for 2 depositions, filed 3 motions, attended a client call where he performed competence with the smooth fluency of long practice. From the outside, it looked like a man doing his job. But inside, the architecture of the floor, something had shifted. The way people moved around Norah's desk was different. Not dramatically. This was not a film. No one started bringing her flowers or speaking to her in reverent tones. But the quality of the attention had changed. People paused when they passed her, asked questions they'd never thought to ask before, listened to her answers with an interest that had not been there 14 months ago. It was the particular social phenomenon of a group recalibrating itself after new information, trying to quietly rewrite its own history into something more defensible. Norah noticed. Of course she noticed. She was Norah Vale. But she did not perform graciousness about it. She was the same, direct, precise, measured. She answered the questions people asked her with the same clarity she brought to everything. She did not punish the sudden interest with coldness, but she did not reward it with warmth either. She simply remained exactly herself, which was, Javier was beginning to understand, the most quietly devastating thing she could have done. On Wednesday afternoon, Javier was at his desk when he heard a voice he recognized from 30 feet away. Male, accented, deliberate. European in that specific way that announced itself without trying. He stood up. Through the glass partition, he could see the reception area, and standing at the reception desk in a dark coat, holding a small card, was Etienne Marot. Javier processed this for approximately 2 seconds. Then he walked out of his office at a controlled pace that was significantly faster than he would have described it as. Marot was not there to see him. This became apparent before Javier had crossed the floor. Marot had already been directed toward Norah's desk, and he was standing in front of it with the easy, unhurried manner of a man who travels internationally enough that walking into offices he has never been in is simply a thing he does. He was carrying a paper bag from the French bakery 3 blocks away, which was, Javier thought, an extraordinary human detail. "I was in the neighborhood," Marot said to Norah, with a slight smile that acknowledged the phrase's inadequacy. Genuinely. "Meeting at Davis Polk on 48th. I thought," he set the paper bag on the corner of her desk, "if the mountain will not come." Norah looked at the bag, then at him, and the smile that crossed her face was the same one Javier had seen at the gala, warm and unguarded, the version of her that did not belong to this office. "You could have called," she said. "I could have," he agreed, "but calling is how people say no more easily." She looked at him for a moment. "Sit down, Etienne," she said. He sat in the chair beside her desk, and they began to talk. And the conversation they had was entirely private and entirely audible to anyone within 15 feet, which in an open-plan law firm meant it was audible to approximately 11 people, who were all suddenly finding reasons to remain at their desks. Javier did not pretend to go back to his office. He stood at a distance that was close enough to hear, but far enough to be technically unintrusive, and he listened. And what he heard was the architecture of an offer being built in real time. Marot's fund was restructuring. He had, in the years since the Dakar program, developed an increasingly sophisticated focus on blended finance vehicles for infrastructure development. He needed, specifically, someone who understood both the legal framework and the operational reality, someone who had built things, not just advised on them. "I have excellent lawyers," he said to Norah simply. "What I need is someone who has stood in the room where decisions are made and understood what those decisions cost. You are perhaps the only person I have encountered in recent years who fits that description, and is currently," he paused with a slight diplomatic delicacy, "available." "I'm employed," Norah said. "For now," Marot said. The echo of Friday night landed in the room like a note struck twice. Norah heard it. Her chin lifted slightly. "You're building towards something specific," she said. "An advisory position," he said. "Senior, significant, structured around your terms." He reached into his jacket and placed a folded paper on her desk. Not a card this time. "The details are there. I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm asking you to read it." Norah did not pick it up immediately. She looked at him. "Why now?" she said. "You could have reached me through the Foundation network 2 years ago." "I could have tried," he said. "I did try, actually. Twice. You had," he searched for the phrase, "made yourself unavailable." "I needed to," she said, and it was the same sentence she had used at the gala, and it carried the same weight, the weight of something private and real and not fully explained. And Marot received it the same way he had the first time, without pressing. "I know," he said gently, "and I respected it then, and I respect it now. But Norah," he leaned forward slightly, "the breath has been long enough." The silence that followed was 11 seconds. Javier counted without meaning to. Then Norah picked up the paper. She folded it once and placed it in her top drawer without reading it, which was either the most controlled thing Javier had ever witnessed or the most devastating. He couldn't decide which. "I'll read it tonight," she said. "That's all I ask," Marot said. He stood, shook her hand, not the perfunctory shake of a business meeting, the two-handed grip of genuine regard, and turned to leave. He passed Javier in the middle of the floor. He looked at him with the polite recognition of a man who remembers faces from events. "Mr. Rivas," he said. "Mr. Mauro," Javier said. "Can I—" "She'll be in touch," Mauro said pleasantly, and walked to the elevator. Javier stood in the middle of the floor. He was aware of Marcus to his left, of Brittany Holloway to his right, of at least 3 other people in his peripheral vision who were performing the act of working with the conviction of people watching something they could not look away from. He looked at Norah. She had already turned back to her computer. Her face was composed and inward, in the particular way of someone processing something significant while maintaining complete external function. She was remarkable at that. He understood now that she had been remarkable at it for 14 months, and he had simply read it as nothing. He went back to his office. He sat down. His hands were not entirely steady, which was something that did not happen to him. He was a man who had delivered unfavorable verdicts to clients without his hands shaking. He was a man who had cross-examined hostile witnesses in federal court with absolute physical stillness. And right now, his hands were not steady because a 71-year-old Belgian investor had just walked into this office and placed something on Norah's desk that Javier could not compete with and could not manage and could not reframe. He picked up his phone. He called Richard Calloway. "Mauro was just here," Javier said when Richard picked up. A pause. "In the building?" "At Norah's desk. Brought pastries. Left an offer." The pause on Richard's end was longer this time. "What kind of offer?" "Advisory. Senior. I didn't see the details." Javier stopped. She put it in her drawer without reading it. "That means she's thinking about it," Richard said immediately. "If she wasn't going to take it seriously, she'd have handed it back." Another pause. "Does Hartwell know?" "Not yet." "He needs to know before Thursday," Richard said. "The meeting is Thursday morning. If she's sitting across that desk with an offer in her drawer, the conversation is completely different." A beat. "Javier, this is moving fast." "I know," Javier said. "You need to think about what you want the outcome to be," Richard said. "Not what the firm wants, what you want, because those two things might not be the same thing right now." He hung up. Javier put the phone down. He thought about what Richard had said. He turned it over slowly, like an object he was assessing for damage. What did he want the outcome to be? The honest answer was complicated. The firm version was simple. Norah should stay, take the position Hartwell was going to offer, bring Mauro's account with her, and the whole situation resolved into a professional success story that everyone could feel good about. Javier had even, in the back of his mind, been constructing the version of events where he was credited with recognizing her potential first, where the gala invitation became, in hindsight, a bold move rather than a cruel one. He recognized that construction. He recognized it with the specific nausea of seeing something in yourself that you don't like. He opened his laptop. He typed a message to Hartwell's assistant, flagging the Mauro visit for the Thursday prep. He typed it plainly, without spin. Then he sat back in his chair and did something he rarely did in the middle of a work day. He just sat. He let the discomfort of the moment exist without trying to solve it. On Thursday morning, Norah walked into Hartwell's office at 9 o'clock and came out at 10:45. Javier knew the duration because he had looked at his watch when she went in and looked at it again when she came out. And 105 minutes was a very long meeting for a preliminary conversation about a role adjustment. 105 minutes was a negotiation. She came back to her desk and sat down and began working as though she had not just spent 105 minutes with the founding partner of one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms discussing the restructuring of her entire professional reality. Javier waited 20 minutes. Then he walked over. "How did it go?" he said. She looked up. "Well," she said. "Can I ask what they offered?" "A senior advisory position," she said. "Cross-practice, working directly with the partners on client development and international accounts." She paused. "Significant restructuring of my role and compensation." "Are you going to take it?" he said. Norah looked at him for a long moment. "I'm thinking about it," she said. "Because of Maro's offer?" he said. "Because of several things," she said. He nodded. He had been going to leave it there, back to his office, back to the professional distance that had reasserted itself over the course of the week. But something stopped him. Something that was not strategy and not calculation. Something simpler and harder to manage. "Norah," he said, "can I ask you something personal?" She looked at him. "You can ask," she said. "The colleague you lost," he said carefully, "in Geneva, the one that made you leave." Her expression changed, not dramatically, a tightening, small and private. "Yes," she said. Were they?" He stopped. He was not going to phrase this correctly, and he knew it. "I'm asking because I want to understand, not to manage anything, not to have information. He stopped again. "I've spent 2 weeks learning who you are, and I feel like I'm reading a book I should have started a year ago, and I want to understand that part, if you're willing." The silence stretched. Norah looked at her hands briefly, then back at him. Something in the look had changed. The professional neutrality was still there, but beneath it, something more human had surfaced. "His name was Daniel," she said. "He was my closest colleague, my best friend in Geneva. He died of a heart attack at 41 years old, at his desk, on a Wednesday afternoon." She paused. "And I found him." Another pause, shorter. "I couldn't go back into the building after that. I couldn't sit at a desk that looked like his desk. I couldn't—" She stopped. "I needed everything to be different, smaller, quieter. I needed a life where the stakes felt manageable for a while." Javier looked at her. He thought about 14 months of watching this woman walk through a door every morning at 7:45 and make coffee she didn't have to make, and answer phones, and hand him documents, and absorb small cruelties with a composure he had mistaken for insignificance. He thought about what that composure had been built on top of. "I'm sorry," he said. And this time, it was not about Tuesday. It was about Daniel and Geneva, and the Wednesday afternoon she did not describe in full, and the long quiet afterward she had brought here to this unremarkable office on the 40th floor of a building on Park Avenue, and the way no one had thought to wonder about any of it. Norah looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. "Thank you," she said. It was simple. It was enough. He went back to his office. He sat at his desk. He thought about Daniel for a moment, a man he had never met, who had died at 41 on a Wednesday, and whose death had sent one of the most accomplished people Javier had ever met into the quiet shelter of an answering phones and making coffee and being invisible for 14 months while she figured out how to be in the world again. And they had used that shelter to make her the punchline. His phone buzzed. A text from Camila. "Still thinking. That's not a bad sign. It just means I'm being honest with myself. Are you doing the same?" He typed back, "Yes, I think so," for the first time in a while. She replied with a single word, "Good." At 3:15, Marcus knocked on his door. "Did you hear?" he said. "Hear what?" Javier said. "Brittany just told me. Norah asked for the paperwork on the advisory position." Marcus's expression was complicated. "She's not taking Maro's offer. She's staying." Javier went very still. "At least for now," Marcus said. "That's what Brittany said. For now." Javier absorbed this slowly. Norah Vale, with an offer from Etienne Marot folded in her top drawer, had asked for the Hartwell and Stone paperwork. She was staying. Not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she was, in her deliberate and considered and entirely autonomous way, choosing this. "Why?" Marcus said, not really to Javier, more to the general air of the situation. "Why would she stay after everything that—" "Because it's her choice," Javier said. Marcus looked at him. "That's the whole point," Javier said. "It's always been her choice. We just didn't know that because we weren't paying attention." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've done a lot of thinking this week." "Yeah," Javier said. "I have." Marcus left. The afternoon continued. At 5 o'clock, the floor began to empty with its usual end-of-day rhythm. Javier stayed at his desk. He was finishing a brief, but also, in a way he didn't fully articulate to himself, he was reluctant to leave. At 5:45, the floor was mostly quiet. And then he heard, from the direction of Norah's desk, a small sound. Not a dramatic sound, just a sharp exhale, controlled quickly, the sound of someone receiving news. He looked through the glass partition. Norah was at her desk, phone pressed to her ear, and her free hand was pressed flat against the desk surface, in the particular way people press things when they need something solid. Her face was composed, but her eyes were closed. He stood. He walked to the door of his office. She opened her eyes. She said 2 words into the phone, "I understand," and put it down. She sat for a moment with her hand still flat on the desk. Then she took a breath. Javier walked out. He stood at the edge of her desk. "Norah," he said quietly, "what happened?" She looked up, and for the first time in 14 months, the composure she wore like a second skin was not entirely in place. It was there, mostly, but at the edges, something raw had surfaced, something real and unmanaged and human. "It's nothing to do with work," she said. Her voice was steady, almost. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. He did not move. He did not offer solutions. He did not fill the silence with anything. He just stood there, present, the way no one at Hartwell and Stone had ever stood for her, and waited. And after a moment she said, "My sister, in Boston. She's in the hospital. They think it's her heart." She stopped. "She's fine, probably fine, but I need to..." She looked at the desk, at the papers, at the neat, organized surface of 14 months of quiet, contained professionalism. "I need to go." "Go," Javier said immediately. She looked at him. "Everything here can wait," he said. "Go." She stood. She picked up her bag, she put on her coat, and her hands were slightly faster than usual, and her breath was slightly shorter. And for one moment, before she turned toward the elevator, she looked like what she was, a person who had lost too much already and was terrified of losing more. "I'll get you a car," Javier said. He had his phone out before she could answer. He booked it, gave her the confirmation, and handed her the phone to show her the details. She looked at the screen. Something moved across her face that was not a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Thank you," she said. "Go," he said again, gently this time. She went. He stood at her desk after she left. The floor was empty. The ordinary evidence of her day was arranged on the desk in front of him. A pen, a legal pad, a coffee cup, the folded edge of a file she hadn't finished. The small material traces of a woman who had come here to rest and had, without anyone deserving it, become something essential. He hoped her sister was fine. He thought about Geneva and Daniel and Wednesday afternoons and the specific weight of being the person who finds someone. He thought about what it cost to carry that quietly through a door every morning and set it down and do the work and not let anyone see. He turned off the lamp on her desk, small and useless gesture. He did it anyway. Then he went back to his office, put on his coat, and for the first time in 14 months, left work without knowing what Norah Vale's tomorrow was going to look like. And the not knowing felt uncomfortably and importantly like the beginning of respect. Norah's sister was fine. That was the word that came through on Friday morning. A text to Javier's phone because she had texted from the car he'd booked, and his number was the last one in her recent calls. Fine. Minor cardiac event, monitored overnight, stable. She would stay through the weekend. Javier read the message at 6:48 in the morning, standing in his kitchen with yesterday's coffee, and felt a relief so specific and so disproportionate to his relationship with the sender that it stopped him for a moment. He stood there and examined that feeling the way you examine something unexpected in a familiar pocket. It was relief on behalf of a woman who had spent 14 months being invisible to him. It was relief that felt earned in the wrong direction. He had not done enough to deserve caring this much. But he did. That was the uncomfortable fact of it. Somewhere in the collapse of his assumptions over the course of 1 week, Norah Vale had become real to him in a way she had not been before. And real people's sisters had heart events, and that mattered now. He texted back, "Glad she's okay. Take the time you need. Everything here is handled." He put his phone down. Then he picked it back up and added, "I mean that." He sent it before he could edit it into something more professionally measured. Norah did not come in on Friday. Javier covered what needed covering, handled the 2 items on her task list that were time-sensitive, and told the receptionist that Ms. Vale was attending to a family matter and was not to be contacted for anything below a genuine emergency. He said this with the authority of a man making a decision, not a man managing a situation. And the distinction was visible enough that the receptionist simply said yes and did not ask follow-up questions. Marcus passed his office at noon and said nothing. He just gave Javier a look that was not quite approval and not quite surprise, landed somewhere between the two, and kept walking. Javier spent Friday afternoon doing something he had been avoiding all week. He opened Norah's personnel file, not her calendar, not her task log, but her actual HR file. Education, employment history, the document that should have told him everything he needed to know on day 1 of her employment at Hartwell and Stone, if he had ever thought to look. He read it for 23 minutes. He did not move during those 23 minutes, except to scroll. He sat in his chair with the screen in front of him and read the credentials of a woman who had been answering his phone and making his coffee for 14 months. And he felt, with a slow and thorough discomfort, the cumulative weight of every assumption he had never bothered to question. 2 graduate degrees, publications in 3 academic journals, a decade of fieldwork across 4 continents, awards from organizations whose names he recognized and whose recognition he understood because he had spent enough years in rooms where those names were currency. A professional history so substantive and so precisely accomplished that the gap between what she had done and what she had been doing at Hartwell and Stone was not a gap at all. It was a canyon. And right there in the file, in the employment section, 14 months ago, the application. Senior Administrative Assistant. The position she had applied for. The position she had taken deliberately, knowingly, with full awareness of exactly what it was and what it was not. She had not fallen into this job. She had chosen it. She had walked into a lesser room on purpose, folded herself down to fit it, and no one, not HR, not the partners, not the 7-year senior associate who handed her tasks every day without eye contact, no one had thought to ask why. He closed the file. He sat for a long time in the particular silence of a Friday afternoon office, the floor half empty, the city doing its end-of-week receding outside the windows. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who needs a public event, a room full of witnesses, a legendary European investor's admiration, before they can see the person who has been standing in front of them all along. He thought about the kind of person he had been, and then, more carefully, more honestly, he began to think about the kind of person he intended to be. Norah returned on Monday. She came in at 7:45, as always. She put her bag on her chair. She made coffee, which Javier had started making himself the previous Friday, and which tasted noticeably worse, a fact that somehow carried more meaning than it should have. She sat down and opened her email and began the day as if the week and a half since the gala had been a normal week and a half, as if nothing had shifted, which was either the most extraordinary act of composure Javier had ever witnessed, or proof that for Norah Vale, the shifting had happened long before, and she was simply continuing in the direction she had already chosen. At 8:20, he walked to her desk with his own coffee and stood in a way that was different from the way he had stood at her desk for 14 months. Not over it, beside it, level. "How's your sister?" he said. "Better," Norah said. "She's home. The cardiologist says the structural issue is minor and manageable with medication." She looked up. "Thank you for the car. It helped." "Good," he said. A brief silence. Then she said, You covered my Friday tasks. Yes, you didn't have to do that. I know, he said. She looked at him for a moment with that clear, measuring attention that he had once read as blankness and now understood as the opposite, as the full, active process of a person deciding exactly how much of themselves to extend toward you. Then she said, "How was the alderman brief?" "Filed at 4:30, he said. "You had the structure laid out so clearly, I basically just executed it." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more real. "That's generally the idea," she said. He went back to his office. He worked. The morning passed. The firm continued its forward motion, as firms do, indifferent to the internal upheavals of the people who inhabit them. At 11 o'clock, Hartwell's assistant called Javier's extension and said that Mr. Hartwell would like to see both him and Ms. Vale at 2 o'clock. Together. Javier relayed this to Norah. She nodded without expression and wrote it in her calendar. At 1:55, they walked to Hartwell's office side by side. It was the first time in 14 months they had walked anywhere together. The hallway was 30 feet long. Javier was aware of every step. Hartwell was standing when they entered, which was unusual. Calloway was there again, same chair as before. But there was a third person in the room, a woman Javier didn't recognize immediately, then did. Carol Meng, Hartwell and Stone's head of talent and development. Her presence meant this was not an informal conversation. This had been structured. "Sit down," Hartwell said. They sat. He remained standing for a moment, which was a Hartwell rhetorical habit, letting the room settle before he occupied it. "I'm going to say something that I should have said 14 months ago," Hartwell said. He was looking at Norah. "This firm failed to see you. That is a failure of process, of culture, and of individual attention. And I take responsibility for the structural part. The individual part," he glanced at Javier briefly, "has been addressed separately." He turned back to Norah. "What I am here to do today is to make an offer that reflects who you actually are, not the role we incorrectly placed you in." Carol Meng placed a folder on the desk in front of Norah. Norah did not open it. "Senior Counsel, International Development Practice," Hartwell said. "It's a new position. We are creating it for you, not retrofitting an existing one. The practice focus is blended finance, international infrastructure, and cross-sector advisory, which is, as I understand it, the space where your work has lived for the last decade." He paused. "The compensation is in the document. It reflects the seniority of the position. There's also a team allocation. You would have support staff, not be support staff, and a client portfolio that begins with the Morrow account, assuming that relationship develops as I anticipate it will." The room was very quiet. Norah looked at the folder, then at Hartwell. "You're building a practice around one client relationship," she said. "I'm building a practice around one practitioner," Hartwell said. "The client relationship is a consequence, not the cause." He paused. "I want to be clear about that distinction." Norah held his gaze. "Why?" she said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. The same directness she applied to everything. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who had prepared for this question and was choosing between his prepared answer and his honest one. He chose the honest one. "Because in 40 years of law, I have occasionally had the humbling experience of recognizing talent after it has already formed its own judgment about whether this firm deserves it," he said. "And I have learned that in those moments, the only appropriate response is honesty and an offer that matches the reality of what I'm asking for." Norah said nothing for a moment. Then, "I have Morrow's offer in my desk." "I know," Hartwell said. "The terms are significant." "I know that too," Hartwell said. "I'm not asking you to dismiss it. I'm asking you to compare them and make the decision that's right for you." He looked at her steadily. "What I can offer that he cannot is a platform, infrastructure, an institution behind your name. Morrow's offer is brilliant and personal and probably financially superior. Mine is," he searched for the word, "architectural. It's a foundation." Norah looked at the folder. She opened it then. She read in silence for 2 minutes and 17 seconds. Javier knew the duration because he counted. because he had nothing else to do with his body while the rest of the room waited with the specific held breath quality of people watching something be decided that they cannot influence. She closed the folder. "I need a week," she said. "You have it," Hartwell said, without hesitation. She stood. She picked up the folder. She looked at Hartwell, and then at Calloway, and then, briefly, at Javier. And then she walked out. The room held its breath for another moment after she left. Then Hartwell sat down. "Well," Calloway said. "She'll take it," Hartwell said, with the calm certainty of a man who has read enough rooms in enough decades to know. Javier wasn't sure. And the not being sure, the genuine openness of that uncertainty, was the thing that told him how far he had traveled in 2 weeks from the man who had held an invitation above her head and let it fall. He left the office. He walked back toward the floor. Norah was at her desk, the folder closed and set aside, already back to work, because Norah Vale did not let professional uncertainty disrupt her professional function, which was probably one of the reasons the whole situation had taken this long to break open. He stopped at her desk. "You don't have to tell me," he said, "what you're going to decide. It's not my business." She looked up. "But I want you to know." He stopped. He had rehearsed nothing this time, which meant what came out was going to be unpolished and probably insufficient. And he said it anyway. "Whatever you decide, I think you should decide it based entirely on what you want your work to mean, not on what we owe you, not on what motto represents, not on any version of this that's about proving something. You've already proven everything there is to prove. You just..." He stopped again. "You should do whatever makes the most sense for the life you're actually trying to build. That's all." Norah looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression that was complex and layered and would have taken him a long time to decode accurately, so he didn't try. He just let her look. Then she said, "Daniel would have liked you, the version of you from this week, not the version from 2 weeks ago." Javier went very still. "He was like that," she said. "Said things plainly, even when they cost him something." She paused. "He used to say that most people's cruelty is just unexamined comfort, the comfort of not asking, of not looking too closely." She looked at Javier with a steadiness that was no longer simply professional. It was personal, and it was direct, and it was the most seen Javier had felt in years. "You looked, eventually." "Too late," he said. "Later than it should have been," she said. "Not too late." She paused. "There's a difference." He nodded. He went back to his office. He sat at his desk and looked at the framed photo, the handshake with Hartwell, the grinning faces of 2 men who thought they knew what they were building, and he thought about Daniel, a man who died at 41, at his desk, on a Wednesday, whose name he had only learned because a woman in a red dress had trusted him enough to say it. He took the photo down. He put it in his desk drawer. He was not sure what he would put there instead, but he knew it was not going to be that. The week moved. Tuesday and Wednesday were ordinary by surface measure, and Javier worked with the particular focus of a man who has decided to stop performing and start functioning. He took on a piece of the Morrow account research that had been assigned to a second-year associate and was going slowly, not to compete with Norah or to position himself, but because the work was interesting and he was good at it, and he wanted to be good at it for the right reasons. He had dinner with Camila on Wednesday night. They went to the Italian place on 54th, which was either a choice that meant something or a coincidence. And halfway through the meal, Camila said, "You're different." "I'm trying to be," he said. "No," she said, "that's what I mean. You're not trying. You just are. There's no visible effort anymore." She looked at him carefully. "That's the version of you I've been waiting for." He looked at her. "Is it enough?" he said. She picked up her fork. "Ask me in a month," she said, but she was almost smiling. And Camila's almost smiles were more reliable than most people's certainties. On Thursday, Marcus told him that 2 of the paralegals had independently gone to HR and asked about internal development pathways after a conversation with Norah about professional growth and what it looked like to build a meaningful career. Javier absorbed this without surprise. It was exactly what you would expect from a woman who could not help, even in the midst of her own professional reckoning, making the people around her better at their jobs. On Friday morning, at 9 o'clock exactly, Norah knocked on his office door. She was holding the Hartwell folder and Morrow's folded paper, one in each hand. She set them both on his desk. "I've made a decision," she said. He waited. "I'm staying," she said. "I'm taking the Hartwell position." He looked at her. "Why?" he said. The same question she had asked Hartwell, the honest one. She was quiet for a moment. "Because Morrow's offer is extraordinary," she said, "and I would be extraordinary in that role. I know that about myself." She paused. "But I've been extraordinary in rooms that already believed in me. That's not the hard thing." She looked at Javier steadily. "The hard thing is building something in a room that got it wrong, staying anyway, proving that dignity doesn't require a perfect environment. It requires a clear sense of your own value inside an imperfect one." She picked up the two folders. "And because—" She stopped. She looked at something inside herself for a moment, something private, and decided. Daniel built things in difficult rooms his entire career. He never waited for the room to deserve him. He just built. She looked back at Javier. "I think I'm ready to build again." The silence in the office was the best kind, the kind that isn't empty, but full of something that had taken a long time to arrive and was finally, simply, here. "You should know," Javier said, "that I'm going to be a better colleague than I've been, not because of what happened, because of what you just said. I want—" He stopped. He found the words. "I want to deserve the room you're choosing to stay in." Norah looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Then start today, not Monday. Today." "Today," he agreed. She left his office. He heard her walk back to her desk. He heard the folder set down. He heard the chair and the keyboard and the quiet, efficient beginning of a new kind of work. At noon, Hartwell himself walked through the floor. Unusual, a partner-level floor walk, and stopped at Norah's desk for 3 minutes. Javier couldn't hear the conversation, but he watched the posture of it. Hartwell standing, attentive, the way he stood for clients. Norah, seated, composed, speaking plainly. An equal transaction. The kind that should have been possible 14 months ago, and was only possible now because of a gold-embossed invitation on a floor and a woman who bent to pick it up and smoothed it against her palm and made a silent, private decision. Marcus knocked on Javier's doorframe at 1:30. "She told HR this morning," he said. "The position is official." "Good," Javier said. Marcus lingered. He had something else. "The paralegals want to do something, like a small, not a party, just something to acknowledge. Because the whole thing," he gestured vaguely at the general air of the last 2 weeks, "has been a lot, and she deserves something acknowledged." Javier thought about it. Then he said, "Ask her first, what she actually wants, not what we think she should want." Marcus paused. Then he said, "Yeah, okay, yeah." He looked at Javier with an expression that had no irony in it. "You know something? You're going to be okay." "I don't know yet," Javier said, "but I'm working on it." Marcus left. The afternoon continued. At 3 o'clock, Javier had a call with a client that went well. At 4:30, he passed Norah's desk and she handed him a document without him asking for it, the revised structure for the alderman follow-up, and said, "You'll need this for Monday." And he took it and said thank you, and meant it in the way you mean things when the word has been emptied and refilled with its actual content. At 5:30, most of the floor had emptied. Javier was finishing notes when he heard a knock on his glass partition. Norah was standing in the doorway with her coat on and her bag on her shoulder, the end-of-day version of her that he had watched leave through a peripheral awareness for 14 months without looking up. He looked up now. "Good night, Javier," she said. "Good night, Norah," he said. She turned to leave, then stopped, without turning back. "For what it's worth," she said, "the invitation was the most expensive joke you've ever told." He looked at her back, the straight posture, the quiet authority, the woman who had walked into a room and silenced it just by being entirely herself. "I know," he said. "Good," she said, and she walked out. He sat in his empty office for a while after she left, the hum of the building settling into its evening. The city outside, doing what cities do, moving, indifferent, enormous, full of people being seen and unseen, recognized and overlooked, valued and dismissed, every single day, in every single room, all the time. He thought about what it cost to be the one who was overlooked. He thought about the particular endurance required to carry your full self into a room that has already decided you are less than what you are, and to go on carrying it, quietly, with no drama, until the room is finally forced to reckon with what it missed. He thought about Norah Vale, who had done exactly that, not because the room deserved it, because she did. That was the lesson. The one hiding inside all of it, beneath the gala and the red dress and the legendary investor and the humiliation of a joke that became the most illuminating night of a man's professional life. The lesson was not about talent being eventually recognized. The lesson was simpler and harder than that. It was about the kind of person you choose to be when no one is watching, when no audience exists, when the only witness to your dignity is yourself. Norah Vale had been that person every single day, in an office that didn't see her, at a desk that diminished her, in a role that asked nothing of the extraordinary thing she was. She had been that person anyway. And she walked out every evening with her head level and her coat on, and she came back the next morning at 7:45, and she made coffee she didn't have to make, and she did the work she was asked to do, and she waited with the unshakable patience of a woman who had always known that her worth did not begin or end with anyone else's recognition of it. That was what the room had missed. That was what Javier Rivas, in the slow and difficult education of the last 2 weeks, had finally and incompletely and honestly begun to understand. The city moved outside the window. The office breathed its empty evening breath. And Javier Rivas, senior associate, 7 years at Hartwell and Stone, turned off his desk lamp and picked up his coat, and for the first time in a long time, left work not as a man managing his own narrative, but as a man trying, quietly and without an audience, to deserve the story he was living. It was a small beginning, but it was real. And real, he had learned from a woman in a red dress, was the only thing that ever lasted.